The last topic for this week is one called microservices. And so it's interesting how trends work, right? So most trends are responses to the negative ilk or the negative ills of a prior trend. And so it's interesting in technology. Microservices is seeking to address some of the ills in the previous sort of past service-oriented architecture, which we touched on yesterday. And again, I'm sorry to throw new terms at people who've never heard them. If you haven't, but if you had heard of SOA or services-oriented architecture, I wanted your brain to know that that's modern in the sense, it was certainly modern 10 years ago, in the sense that it supports microservices thinking and the ability to start to decouple services and HTTP enable them or make them APIs. But what it does not address, what services-oriented architecture does not address, is things like, how do I distribute teams? How do I engineer for cloud? How do I support platform as a service? And so microservices, which is really the next iteration of thinking on the service-oriented architecture movement 15 years ago, is really the further decoupling of not just the services and the code from each other, but also the repos, also the delivery processes, also the development and distribution teams, enabled by things like DevOps, things like cloud, things like PaaS. And so now, for those that are brand new, let me step back and say microservices is a design pattern applied to software applications where your apps and frequently your services and often your code bases are broken up into a series of very small, relatively small software applications. And so historically, you might have built an app as all one thing. Microservices seeks to say, okay, we're going to build all one thing, but we're going to build it as a series of smaller applications or services, microservices. Now, there's a variety of mocks within this conversation, things like what I call nanoservices, which take microservices down to an infinitesimally small, and to me, it's actually an anti-pattern. People who really get excited about all the hype of microservices try to decouple their things into really itty-bitty small things, and it comes with some overhead or lots of overhead depending on how small your nanoservice is. So that's a me term. But microservices done well takes an application, traditionally one big thing, monolithic application, and breaks it up into a series of services so that you can do a lot of things. For example, you can distribute it more easily, you can patch and update it in a way that is insulated. So when you think about an application that you want to have near 100% uptime, patching and change management become critical, because if you are touching your application in production, you have the chance of taking it down or degrading it in some way. So microservices try to isolate that by saying, we're only going to touch this sliver of the application, and all the other parts we're not going to touch. So they remain safe and up and so unimpacted is the theory. So part of having a modern app is thinking about how do I take something into the cloud to leverage platform as a service? How do I decouple it, this microservices thinking we've been talking about, and then all the way down to the software level? So how do I break up my repositories to support distributed teaming and DevOps and incremental release? And then lastly, as we talked about on day one, security becomes an interesting and important part of that. Microservices really attempt to design the app from the ground up with all of those principles in mind. So while it's possible, I'll close by saying this, while it's possible to have a modern app and not have a microservices-based app, microservices thinking should be applied so that you can, again, say you've been able to decouple all of your services from each other so that they do support things, as we talked about, hot pluggability from third parties, interoperability with third parties, or even your own other internal applications, distributed teams, DevOps, and then also cloud hosting.